In this video, we're going to start our text adventure game project. I'm going to go over everything you need to know to get started using Godot, even if you've never used it before. So if you've never used Godot before, this is a totally beginner-friendly series. I will expect a little bit of knowledge about programming. You don't have to be familiar with GDScript per se, but you'll want to be somewhat familiar with core programming concepts and have looked at GDScript before. If you haven't already, I highly recommend going through Godot's official tutorial. I'll put the link to that in the description below. But once you've done that video or that tutorial, you'll have everything you need to follow along with this series. In this video, all we're going to get to is creating our game. So it's going to look like this. You're going to have a game window that has an area to see responses and game information that's happening, and then an area for us to input text. So we're going to cover everything you need to know about how to use Godot, how to use nodes, control nodes, how to set up this kind of game window, how to style your boxes and make something that looks nice and has a retro aesthetic like this, and will be set up for future videos where we'll start actually implementing functionality into our game. Let's get started. So what we're going to do first, before we get to actually creating our game, is we're going to give a brief overview of how to use the Godot engine and all the stuff you see here. So if you've used Godot before, you can skip this part. I just opened up a completely empty project with nothing in it, so you can skip to the next part in the video. But otherwise, let me show you how to use Godot and explain some of the stuff we see here on the screen. So first, we see all these options up at the top here. You don't really have to worry about them right now. If you need to go back to the project select screen, you can hit project and then quit the project list. And besides that, we'll kind of cover these settings as we go. On the left side here, we see our scene tree. So the way Godot works is Godot is built, or your Godot game is built up of nodes. And those nodes are related to each other in a tree structure. So at the top of your game, you have one root node. And that root node has child nodes, and each of those child nodes can have their own child nodes, and it keeps going on, and your tree can be as tall as it needs to be. And whenever you're talking about a group of nodes, so a parent node with some children, you're talking about a scene. So in Godot, you have individual nodes, and then collections of nodes are scenes. And a scene is also a tree. So your game is a tree of nodes. You can also think of it as a scene, but each individual subtree that makes up that tree is also a scene. So scenes are how you make nodes and collections of nodes in Godot really reusable. And that'll make more sense in just a few minutes when we actually start making our game here. But so this is where you add scenes or nodes to your game and how you interact with them. Is this in this scene section up here? Down here in the file section is it shows all the files that exist in your game's project folder. In Godot, it always calls it res. This is just a localized path for the folder that your game exists in, because it only shows you the folders. It only gives you access to the folders and files in your game's project, so that you don't accidentally change something you didn't mean to. And then over here on the right side of the screen, we have the Inspector tab and the Node tab. Both of these show you more properties about the currently selected node. Because we don't have a node selected, there's nothing here right now, but we will work with that in a second. Then up here at the top, there's 2D, 3D views that you can switch in between, the script editor view. You basically won't usually need to press these buttons. It'll automatically change for you depending on what nodes you're working with. Up here, we have buttons that let you run your game, so you can hit play, or Command B is the shortcut, or Control B if you're on Windows, to play your game. If you want to play a specific scene, which is a very powerful and awesome feature of Godot. So if you don't want to run your whole game, but just want to play one specific small scene, like you have a player that you just want to run around without having to run your entire game, you can hit Command R, hit this play scene button, Command R, Control R, and you'll be able to play and interact with that specific scene, that collection of nodes, instead of the entirety of your game. So that's about it for a basic overview of Godot. We're going to go through all of this more later on as we get through the series. You've also got some buttons down here, such as Output, Debugger. This Output tab is the most common one you'll need. It just kind of shows output from print statements that you might have in your game, but you'll get more familiar with this as we go. So with that, I think we are ready now to start actually adding nodes to our scene. So we talked a little bit about what nodes are and what scenes are. There are three different types of nodes in Godot. There are 2D nodes, which are just node 2Ds. There's 3D nodes, which are called spatials. So a spatial and a node 2D are equivalent to each other. And then there's control nodes, which are UI nodes. They're user interface nodes. And you can see all that here. So under our basic default node, we have a spatial, which is any 3D node, and a node 2D. So think of spatials as node 3Ds, and I think they're actually going to be renamed to node 3Ds in Godot 4. So it's a little confusing, but spatials are node 3Ds, node 2Ds are for 2D games. And then control nodes are for user interface elements. And we can expand any of these and see more options under them. These are just the kind of root nodes. So under node 2D, I have sprites, I have particles, I have cameras, collision shapes, etc. Godot comes with all of these built-in nodes that will do things that you need, so you don't have to implement all of it on your own. Same thing under spatial, we'll see also cameras, also collision shapes, but these are in 3D instead of 2D. So it's important you're using the correct node for what you want to do. Because our text adventure game is going to be primarily text and user input, we're going to be doing a lot of work in this control node, which is UI nodes again. So if I expand this, we'll see a lot of user interface nodes, such as pop-ups, containers, rectangles, graphs, lists, labels, etc. Things that are meant to give options or user interface elements to the user. So this is where we're going to be spending a lot of our time. And to start our game, I'm going to create a control node. So I'm not going to select any of the subnodes. I'm just going to select this basic overarching control node and hit create. And this is going to be our game. And you'll see now all of a sudden we have a control node right here on our left. It's the only node in our scene or in our game. And then on the right here, you'll see there's actually properties that we can change and edit about our control node now that we actually have a node selected. So the first thing I'm going to do is double click on this control node. You could also right click and hit rename, but I'm going to double click it. And I'm going to call this game. This is going to be our game scene. So I'm just changing the name of our node. And this is going to be the root node for our game for now. And then I'm going to hit Command S or Control S, or you can just come up to the scene button up here and hit save scene. Either work. I'm going to hit Command S, and we're going to save this just as game. And you'll see all of a sudden I've got a game.tscn, which is a scene file in our file system here. So when you have multiple scenes, you can double click them down in your file system to open them up top. So we have our first Godot project and we have our first node added. Now we're ready to start adding some more nodes and kind of talk through how to use control nodes in Godot, and we will start and format our game. So I'm going to explain some things about how control nodes work as we start adding more to our game, and it's okay if you don't understand them all right now. It'll make more sense as we keep going. But control nodes are pretty smart about realizing the width, the dimensions, the width and height of our game. So if I select our control node and go to layout up here, I can tell it automatically how to lay out. We want this control node, it's going to be our game. So we want it to be the full rectangle, to take up the full screen. You'll see this little light blue line here. This is your camera or your window size. And so if I hit full rectangle while our control node is selected, our game node, you'll see that all of a sudden our game has expanded to fit our entire window. So that means that we have told our game, hey, fit the entire screen, and then if the screen expands, expand as well to match it. So if I hit Command S to save, now we'll have a game. So this is good, except there's just nothing really going on. So we're going to add a few other control nodes now to start formatting our game. And the thing we're going to do in this first episode, we're not going to build really any functionality, but we're going to build out our window so it looks like a text adventure game, and we've got the pieces we need to start implementing functionality later on. So let's talk about some of the control nodes that we can use in Godot. If I hit this plus button, this is how I bring up the window to add new nodes. So once I do this, I can add any of Godot's built-in nodes here. And the node that I want to add now is a panel container. So containers in Godot are basically control nodes that format all of their children automatically. You can manually control nodes. So if I go up here and hit the move mode and then move our control around, you can see I have control over moving it. I'm going to undo that. When you have a container node, you cannot move its children manually. The container node automatically determines the size and position of its children. So what we want is a container node that's going to contain all of our game elements and will help automatically determine how those elements are laid out. So we're going to start with a panel container. So I'll hit container and come down into panel container. Another thing you can do though, because it's confusing and difficult to remember where everything is you can just type up here. So if I start typing panel container, we'll see right here. And it's important, don't use a panel, we want a panel container. So if I do a panel container, I can also come over to our layout and hit full rectangle for this one. And we'll see we now have this panel that extends for the entire width of our game. This is good, but it kind of looks a little weird right now. We'll change it in a bit. The reason we're using a panel container is because panel containers come with this background, and you can edit their panel style to make them look differently. So we want to do some coloring and formatting of what our game looks like. That's why we're using a panel container as our root. Now, the next thing we want to do is make sure our children aren't touching the edges of our screen. That kind of looks bad and it doesn't sit well with different monitors. You always want to leave some safe space at the edge of your screen. So what we're going to do is add as a child of our panel container a margin container. So what a margin container does is it lets you set margins on each side that children will be confined to. So you see our margin container is slightly less big than our panel container. And we, below as a child of our margin container, we'll change the margins in a second, we're going to add a VBox container. So what a VBox, there's two types of box containers. You'll see there's an HBox and a VBox. A HBox container will let you stack items horizontally, so it'll create columns, and you can specify the width of each column. You can do some customization within there, but it's a simple way to format items in column formation. However, we want to stack things vertically in rows, so we're going to use a VBox container. And if this is confusing, again, I promise as we keep working with these, they will be a lot more familiar. So I'm going to add a VBox container here. Now, we haven't renamed our panel container or our margin container, and I think that's fine, but when I'm using VBox containers and HBox containers, it can get a little confusing, so I like to rename them. And so I'm going to rename our VBox containers rows, because I think it just makes it a little bit easier for me to remember, hey, this is the overarching container that is determining the rows, how our elements in our game are vertically set up, how they're laid out. So we've got this rows container now. And if I select our rows container and our margin container, you see this orange box, their dimensions are the same. But what happens if we take our margin container and change these margins to be 20 on each side? Now if I select our rows container, or our rows element, our rows node, you'll see that it's much smaller because there's a margin of 20 pixels being applied to each side. So if I make this 40 on each side, then it'd be even smaller. We'll stick with 20. And again, I'm finding this under custom constants. Each container or UI element will often have a custom constant section where it has items that are unique to that specific control node. So our margin container has custom constants that let us determine the margins of each side. So let's go through and set these to be 20 again. Margin right, top, left, and bottom. Okay, so if I select our rows now, we see we've got a pretty good margin on the side of the screen, which is nice because now our UI elements aren't just going to butt up right to the side of the screen. This is perfect. This is exactly what we want. But let's talk about our layout for our container here. We want to have a big section up here that's going to take up most of the screen, and this is going to be where all the interesting stuff is happening. It's going to show the player what they've previously inputted, what they've typed in, and it's also going to display any responses from the game. So we're going to need one big panel up here that is going to contain the information from the game. And then we're also going to want a panel down at the bottom where the player actually types their input. So we're going to add both of those now. And they're going to be children of our rows because, again, we are using our rows VBox container here to lay these out vertically automatically for us. We don't have to code any of the layout. Godot is going to do it for us. So as a child of our rows, I'm going to come up here and hit the plus button. Additionally, besides hitting the plus button, man, you can hit Command A to bring that box up. Control A on Windows. So you can either hit the plus button to add a child or hit Command A. I really like using hotkeys. It's a little bit faster once you get used to them. So I'll try and give hotkeys as we go along for each operation I'm doing. So the child we're going to add of our rows is going to be another panel container because we want our history area or our game area to be slightly different colored so it's easy for the user to make out. Now, the problem is that we've got two panels here, but they look kind of the same. We kind of want to differentiate from them. So what we're going to do is use Godot's built-in styling functionality of panels to change the color of what our game looks like. So let's start with our background, and I'll actually rename this to be background, our top panel container. So if I select this and come into custom styles, you'll see that there's a panel element right here. So we can modify this panel property to apply our own custom style to our background here, which is what we want to do. So I'm going to select this empty button and just click it. And there's a couple options for different built-in styles you can do. You can add a style box texture if we had a background, an image that we wanted to apply, but we don't for now. We just want to do a flat color. So we'll hit style box flat, and we're going to create a new style box flat here. And you'll see automatically we've got this gray background. Let's make it something that looks a little bit, that stands out a little bit less. And if I come to background color here, this little property in the preview, I can adjust the background color, and let's make it a dark gray, not black, but a darker gray. So right about, not quite black, but pretty dark. I think that's good. So now we can see a little bit more of a difference between our panel up here, our game info panel, and our background. And we're actually going to do the same thing for our game info panel. So I'm going to call this and say, let's call it game info. And here we're going to come into our custom styles as well, hit new style box flat, and on this one we're going to make it slightly lighter. Not super light, but a little bit lighter. We can't really see it now, so what I'm going to do, we'll adjust this in a second. There's a lot of different properties here on controls that are going to be important for us, but right now the only one we need to know that we'll talk about is size flags. So our rows container takes up all of this space here, but our game info only takes up this much space. And that's because by default, these controls only take up as much space as they need unless they're told otherwise. So one way we can change that and tell our game info panel here to take up as much space as it can is we can come into our size flags and we can hit expand on the vertical. So you'll see both horizontal and vertical are fill. What fill means is that you're telling this control, hey, take up as much space as you need, but we don't want it to just take up as much space as it needs. We want it to vertically take up as much space as it can. So we're going to hit expand. All of a sudden we see our game info panel expand to take up as much space as our rows container is going to give it. So now we've got this, and we see that this is a pretty good color. It stands out from the background, but also kind of is this just nice gray. So we've got our game info section. Now we're good to add our input area. So in order to add our input area, we're going to create another panel container. So I'm going to select our rows, and I'm going to hit Command A or hit the arrow up there, and I'm going to create another panel container. And this is going to be input area, we'll call it. And so you see we've got a new panel container down at the bottom here. And what we kind of want to do is make it take more space than this, because right now, remember, our game info is saying, hey, take up as much space as you can. We don't want our input area to take up as much space as we can. If we set the size flag of vertical to expand, it would take up half the screen, because both of these game info and input areas would be competing to take up as much space as they can, so it would even out. But we don't want this. This is just an input area. It only needs a little bit of space. And so what we can do instead is give it a minimum size. So if I come into rect here, this is the rectangle properties. You can set the properties for this node. Now remember, we said that containers determine the position and size of your rectangle. So if you change these, you'll be a little disappointed because they will get overridden by its parent if it is a child of a container node. So we can change these. I could change its size to be 2000, and it looks like it changed, but as soon as I toggle it on and off, all of a sudden it gets set back because our container is really determining its size. But what we can do that our container won't affect is set a minimum size. And so we could give this a minimum size of, say, 40. And what we're doing is we're saying, hey, this has to take up at least 40 pixels of its height. It has to be at least 40 pixels tall. We could also do that for the X, but we don't actually care right now. The size that our container is giving it is perfectly fine. So let's actually make this a little bit bigger. Let's do 60. And I think that looks pretty good. And all of a sudden we have a minimum size of 60 here. And even if we try and reset our size here, it's always going to keep that minimum size. Even if we hide it and then show it again, it's going to keep that minimum size. So when you have a control that's a child of a container, you can't really do much with the position and size, but you can change the minimum size, which is a nice way to give elements a certain minimum height or width. So now that we have a minimum size and we've got an input area that looks good, let's go into our custom styles here. We'll make a new style box flat like we have, select this, and we want this one to be gray too, but just slightly lighter than the other grays, I think. I think that's pretty good. So you can adjust this as needed, and if you want to do an aesthetic that isn't gray, you want to make purple and blue and green, go ahead, make this your own game for sure. I'm just going to keep it at a gray, kind of like this, just to give it a simple old school aesthetic. So we've got our input area set up, we've got our game and our container looking good. One problem is that it'd look a little bit better if there was some more space in between our input area and our game info area. So in order to do that, we can come to our rows node here, and as the custom constant of a VBox or HBox container, there's a separation property you can set. And this determines how much space there should be between each row. It defaults to a very low number. I think it defaults to like 5 or something. And if I check it and put it at 0, you'll see they just butt up against each other. But we want a little bit more than that. So if we set it to 20, that kind of gives a little bit more definition. And I like doing 20 because remember, 20 is what we set as the margins on the side. So it looks consistent. There's the same amount of space on our side margins as there is between elements. And this is the really cool thing about Godot's layout system. Because we set the separation to 20, you might expect that one of these elements is going to get smaller or get pushed off the screen. But remember, we're telling our game info panel here to take up as much space as it can to vertically expand. And so when our rows, when we increase our separation, what it does is it decreases the available room for our game info panel to take up. So it just makes it push up, or it makes it go up a little bit and take up less space because there's less available space for it to take up. But it means that Godot is handling laying out our components in a really nice, pleasing way. We don't have to do any of the hard work of coding our layout for us, and we're letting Godot's layout system take care of it. So when you use containers in Godot, you lose a little bit of flexibility because you are letting them determine the size and the position of your child nodes, of your control nodes. But the nice thing that comes out of it is you get a really powerful and flexible layout system that's going to handle it for you. So in this video, we haven't set up any of our functionality, but we have a game area that looks great. It kind of has the aesthetic we want, and we've gone over everything we need to know about how to start a project in Godot and get our text adventure game going. So this is going to be it for the first video. In the next one, we'll actually start implementing some functionality. I hope that this video has been helpful for you. If it has, a like and subscribe to support the channel are always appreciated. We'd love to have you in our Discord server. You can ask any questions you have there. The link to that to join is in the description. And if you found my work helpful, donating on Buy Me a Coffee to help me be able to continue making great videos is always appreciated. Thanks so much, everyone. See you in the next video.